I am Nina Heinzinger, and over here is.
Hi, I'm Whitney Pratt. I'm the education coordinator with Nourish, and I was a food corps service member for 2 years, and I think I've been in 10 school gardens that I've worked in.
So Whitney has had a lot of on the ground experience, and I work for DPHHS and Food and Consumer Safety. I haven't had a lot of experience in school gardens, but I've been quite involved in the Helena Community Garden and a lot of the lessons learned through there as well. And my background is in food science and food microbiology and obviously food safety. So today we're going to start with a story. If I can get this to go now, hold on. Yeah, that's what, there we go. So I want to start with a brief story. And since we're getting started a little late, I'm just going to put the headlines up there for you. So this was something that happened out in California a couple years ago, actually, in a school garden. And you can see from the headlines here, students sick with one hospitalized after eating mushrooms from a school garden. This is actually, you can see the YouTube video on this. The headline there, LA school garden closed after children sickened by mushrooms. There were several kids actually involved in this food poisoning outbreak. So just to be aware that this is not where we want Montanan school gardens ending up in our headlines and on our local news for things like this. We want to see it because all the local kids are eating great, safe food out of the gardens. And so today we're going to learn about how we can have that. We talked about produce from gardens. And if you haven't been paying any attention to the newspapers in the last couple of years, we've had a lot of outbreaks tied to produce. And we're going to touch on some of those concerns as we look at gardens. So what can we see in terms of gardens? We can see a lot of different things coming up for produce. So, leafy greens contaminated with salmonella. We've seen that over the last year. Bagged salad mix, and you can't see that because with cyclospora. Onions with salmonella. This was a big nationwide outbreak. Actually, we had 72 cases here in Montana of individuals with salmonella traced back to onions. But how does produce become contaminated? How do you guys think produce becomes contaminated? When you think about a garden setting, what are some possibilities for produce to get contaminated?
Little visitors that come that we don't want in our garden anyway.
Okay. Creatures?
Yes.
Okay.
Not the children. Like unsafe handling.
Handling. Great.
Compost.
What?
Compost, maybe?
Compost, another sort, yeah. Lots of different ways. And we're going to touch on some of those some more. Water can often be a source. How many of you remember romaine lettuce? Okay. Probably from the water. Soil. Soil itself can carry a variety of different bacteria. Nearby, little critters. And the processing, the handling. So we kind of touched on a lot of those. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at food safety concerns when you're planting your garden, when you are growing, and then when you are harvesting and consuming those products. So we're going to touch on those three different areas. And as we go through this, I'm going to ask you guys some questions. Whitney's going to share some stories from her own experience, and we'll kind of summarize some takeaway points as we go through it. So right now, I'm giving you an assignment, and for those virtually on there, I'm giving you an assignment as well, and you'll be using the chat box here. I want you to, I've put paper on the tables. I'm going to give you, if we started a little bit late, I'm going to give you about 4 minutes to write down anything you can think of when you're planting a garden, things you should consider in terms of food safety. So just write down, I already gave you a couple clues, but I want you to think of anything that might be important when you're planting that garden that you need to think about in terms of food safety.
So when I think about food safety in the school garden, I think about why the garden is there and how much that affects how you have to plan for food safety. So if this is a production garden, you need to know where will hands be washed, how will food get from the production garden to storage, how will harvesting tools be kept clean, how they be sanitized. There's so many different levels. If you are doing a production garden versus an outdoor classroom garden, might not need all of those concerns to be addressed quite in the same way. Versus, like a sensory garden or just purely an outdoor classroom space. So I have been in many gardens that started out as this is just an outdoor classroom, but then transitioned into being a food production space. And that leads to all these issues of we don't have a place to wash our hands. We don't have the right capacity for how to transport this food to the kitchen, to the fridges. So really thinking about what it's for and why that's so important. Like one of our gardens, we had to get permission to be able to be in the school building all summer so we could wash our hands so we could safely process everything, which wasn't the original intent. So we just had to backtrack and go through all these different stages. So I just think understanding why your garden is there and what its uses are so important for figuring out the food safety aspects.
So now let's see what you have in terms of your group. So do you guys have a spokesperson over here that can just read off your first two items from your list?
The soil and the amendments.
Okay, soil and amendment. And this group over here, two items from your list.
Ooh, we have water source and then who is doing the handling.
Okay, so water and then handling, okay? And so from the chat box, two more that we haven't had yet.
Source of seeds and location relevant to cattle, etc.
Okay, so location and source of seeds. So a couple more from your list that we haven't covered yet.
Possibly fencing for critters or larger
Fencing for animals. Do you have another one?
We had
storage and transportation.
Storage, transportation, okay,
we had a sink for hand hygiene and for washing vegetables potentially.
okay. So some sort of sink or access to being able to wash both produce and hand. Anything else?
We had organic versus non-organic controls, and then how do you deal with it afterwards? How they're going to clean that.
So organic and non-organic, and how about from the list over here?
Soil and other input sources and drainage.
Okay, so soil and drainage, okay. So we've got a few more things on our list, I know, and some of these are going to come up later, but we're going to kind of move on to a summary of this part, and then we'll look at some of the other things. So in terms of planning a garden, obviously the site. So what we just touched on, site selection is very important, okay? Why? Because that site needs to be someplace that you know how that area was used before. If you build your school garden on a place that has chemically contaminated soil, you're not going to want to eat the produce that comes out of that garden. Now, you might plant something that's just an outdoor space in that area where you're not consuming that material, but it is important to understand the previous uses. The drainage. Is water running from your cattle operation into your garden? Is the water running from someplace that carries contaminants into the garden? So in and out. Obviously, And this has been an issue in some places where a school garden was placed too close to a building. And then that water caused problems for the structure as well. So again, it's important to think about where it's draining. Soil tests, being able to understand what's in that soil that you're going to use. And we'll kind of cover that as well in a minute.
And then I have a one for this. In Whitefish, we have this huge, amazing greenhouse, and I wasn't there. They purchased soil from a really reputable local source, and it was extremely contaminated. And it's taken 2 years for us to fully remediate the soil and for anyone to be able to eat anything out of that building. So not only should you get it from a reputable source, but you have to test it. And that happened, it's a very well-funded building, like tons of experts involved, and we still got really contaminated soil there.
So, and I think that's so important in terms of soil. We often don't think about soil, but it's a key ingredient of our growing space. And so if we don't start with good soil, we're not going to be able to grow good food. And we see this even in terms of our food supply. If you've looked at the level of arsenic in various foods, it's often influenced on where that food is grown. And those heavily laden soils just naturally have a lot of arsenic. It gets taken up into those foods. So it is very important in terms of that. Materials that you build that garden out of. And don't feel like you need to write this all down, because I'm going to give you a resource at the end that a lot of this material came out of. So how many of you have seen planting in tires, rubber tires? Okay. Gardens surrounded by wood that's been treated. The chemicals from those materials can leach into the soil. So we want to think about that as we're building that garden. And we want to use materials that are not going to affect our crop. So the soil, the building materials, and of course the water. Yeah.
We have a question from in the chat box here from Tim. He's asking, who's testing the soil for you? Is it students or other professionals?
Okay, so the best place to get your soil tested is to work with your county extension agent. They can help you. Usually they even have the little plungers that you can use to test soil with and collect a sample that can then be sent into a lab. So I work here with the Lewis and Clark County extension agent for the soil samples. So reach out to your county extension agent would be the best source on those soil tests. And usually they're not terribly expensive, around $25, $30, depending on what lab you're working with. Water can be tested a lot of different places. And it is important to think about where is that water coming from for the garden. So this has been an issue in some cases where somebody's built a garden, didn't bother with any plumbing to water the garden. And then the school's like, hey, we're not going to let you tap into the building because they don't want to have that faucet where kids can play with it and things like that. So water is very important. The source, is it coming from a well? Is it irrigation water? Is it treated water? So something to keep in mind. Is it potable? Can you drink it? So a lot of times irrigation wells, that water's not necessarily drinkable. You have to have it tested to determine if it's drinkable. So
like city water sprinkler system.
It's potable water, so it's fine to drink. So you can actually use that in washing your produce. And if somebody wants to drink in the garden, then as long as they're not using a non-food grade hose, you can actually get water and drink it. But then again, you gotta think about what that water is running through before you consume it. So not all plumbing is designed for potable water. So again, this is something to work with a plumber, work with somebody who understands things in terms of that water. Like at our garden, we have an irrigation well. It's a lot cheaper. You're not paying for city water. We had that water tested to make sure that it was potable, that you could drink it. But again, that requires testing to determine that. Fencing you touched on, fencing, animal exclusion. Animals carry, I love my dog, but I don't let him go in my garden. Actually, one time, they dug up everything. But yeah, you need fencing to keep the animals out. Animals carry a lot of different diseases that we don't want to introduce into our produce. So actually, and you probably had that problem up in California. We've had that problem actually here in Helena too, deer getting into some of the community gardens. So, some sort of fencing or cover of that garden to keep animals out. You don't necessarily have to have the entire garden enclosed. So you can see in this one, actually, this is just individual beds enclosed. It makes it a little more difficult to get to those beds if you do it that way. But there are different covers you can buy that are just for a single bed. But usually you're going to see some sort of enclosure to keep the animals out. Okay, so now you guys are going to have to work again, and those people online are going to have to get ready in the chat. Whitney's going to share some of her experiences, and then we're going to share what your groups got and kind of summarize some of that information. So, Whitney's had a lot of fun here. I think she's touched on a couple of these, but to kind of bring them up again in terms of things.
So I already mentioned the contaminated soil. One of the benefits of that is that we actually did use mushrooms to remediate the soil, which was a really cool high school student project. So it wasn't our plan for the garden, but it was a very cool project for those kids to take on. And they were successful. It took a long time, but that was a very exciting way to take that on.
What did the mushrooms take up then?
I think it was, I came in after this, but I think it was mostly herbicide contamination.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it was really heavy levels of contamination. And then in our production garden at Kalispell School District, so this garden, everything goes into the school cafeteria to the central kitchen. We actually made a GAP plan at this school garden, a good agricultural practices plan. And we did that for multiple reasons, but we just really wanted to protect ourselves and know that we were going through all the steps necessary and the steps that we would ask farmers who we source from to go through. And our plan was not extensive, but it was about water source, our handling, hand washing techniques, all of that. And we also do like harvest logs and an ability to track what we grow. Another thing I would add on to that is that becomes really complicated when you have a lot of kids in the garden, because it's a lot harder to translate like, oh, that fell on the ground, we probably shouldn't eat that. Or, oh, you can see that there is a bird pooped right on that plant, probably should. It can be harder when you have 25 kids to really translate that information, but it is really important. But we don't, in our gardens that aren't production, we don't track, like, make sure everyone's doing hand washing if you're really careful, but we don't track like what was harvested, who harvested it, where it went, but we do that in all of our production gardens. So who harvested, where it went, the amount, all of that. And then one of our school gardens needs a lot of input, so a lot of compost and a lot of manure. And we follow organic standards for when we apply that manure and when time to harvest, which these are all like in GAP and all of that, but just being really careful that we're really intentional. When do inputs go in? When do we harvest?
So let's see what the groups had to say now. So again, I'll just have you share a couple from your list. So this group gets to go first this time. So
We had said like insect and animal control also, and then with like the kids comment about like hand washing and things that are dirty.
okay, so a couple things there, and now
We talked a little bit about weed control, weeding tools that are being used, fertilizer, pesticides, and then just other things about what to consider, maybe not so much food safety, but just your phosphatates and plant and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Just
So
we did talk
when
about
to plant,
supports.
when to plant. No. Okay, other things from your group?
Like soil contamination and like the who's gonna do the handling. We have quite a few on that first list that
Okay.
overlap.
And how about from our,
One thing was just talking about critters, keeping pests out of the garden, and specifically the challenge of birds, which are much harder to fence out of the garden. And we all know some of the smaller critters, doesn't matter what your fence looks like, they're going to come in. Also similar like fertilizer, soil management, weed management, and then a lot about just general growing, like plant selection, companion planting, distancing.
yeah, okay. So a lot of different factors I'm hearing in terms of it, but some general themes as well. So when we talk about growing, obviously, when we're growing, we may be putting things into the garden in terms of fertilizer or in terms of weed control. So, and these are just some examples of different products you might see, but it's something to talk about when you're planting that garden, when you're starting. Are we doing this for production? Is this material going to be consumed? Or are we just doing it more for demonstration? Obviously, we want to think about those chemicals and fertilizers if they're organic or if they are synthetic. So you see a bunch of different choices here. My favorite tool for weeds is actually these right here. Hopefully you guys can see them. So weed control mostly by hand. Just so that you don't have to introduce a lot of things. And what's your experience been up there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we all of our school gardens are, we call them like chemical free. So we try to not use anything. If we do use anything, we use organic methods. One thing with a school garden that we've noticed is that often our school gardens are surrounded by the lawn that is managed by the school district, and we have many times watched them spraying the grass all around our garden. And so we often put up signs and we work really closely with maintenance to talk about why that's really important. And sometimes the best we can get is for them to tell us when they're spraying, so we can be really careful that we're not harvesting anything even a few days after they're spraying. But it's worth considering what is going on outside the garden is very likely to come into the garden. And we have had like chemical drift in our gardens for sure. So that has definitely happened. And then another thing, I know that the Peas Farm has an orchard, but if you have an orchard, there's a whole nother level to consider in terms of applications. And in the Flathead, we have so many, we also have a lot of like cherry growers and other growers, so we have to be pretty intentional. If we don't spray and we get a lot of pests, we can also get into trouble with our agricultural communities. So just really paying attention to what you spray and why, because sometimes it's not just like, oh, we want this to be organic, but also we can't, if we let pests flourish in our orchard, that could really affect our local growers. So orchards are kind of a, at least for us, it's another level.
Yeah, and so that's something to think about when you're planting. You're planting different things like fruit trees versus, annual vegetables, that there are different things that you might need to use. And then obviously the use of raw manure. Whitney touched on that. There are specific directions in terms of using manure in gardens and a certain length of time. There's the 90-120 rules. But if you're going to use raw manure, you need to be familiar with those rules in terms of the length of time between its application and harvest.
And know where your manure is from, and it's likely you might want to get it tested. It could come in with a lot of weed seeds, and it could come in with like pesticides or herbicides in it.
Yes, yeah, and that's actually happened in a garden I was involved in where they got manure from a source and it brought in a lot of weeds.
Yeah, a lot of weeds.
So just something to think about there. The use of compost, again, compost, a mixture of different materials, how that compost is being produced, and what's in it. We usually discourage the use of animal products in compost. And so just vegetable products, and there's a lot of different information out there on compost. Montana Extension puts out great guides on composting in terms of what to incorporate and quantities, but you want to be aware that that can be a source of things, so avoiding those animal products in the compost. Question?
Yeah, we have another virtual question. What is the manure rule? Is it 90 to 120?
It's like 90 days if it's aged and 120 if it's raw, but don't quote me on that. It's actually I can send that. There's some resources that we have that I'll be referring to at the end that have that information in it. But if you just check with your extension agent as well, they would have that information on the application of manure.
And I really would recommend Good Agricultural Practices. There are so many resources for that, and it's a really easy. They already have the checklist. They have what you should do. It's a great source.
And then obviously donations as well. Those donations, as we touched on, making sure that they're free of seed, weed seed, herbicides. So another place I was involved with got soil that was contaminated with herbicides and wouldn't grow anything, kind of like that whole sequence you went through. So obviously plant selection in terms of you want to plant things that you know what they are and the source of. Yeah.
Just going back to the fertilizer, is there like a liquid organic fertilizer that's recommendable for something?
There's a lot of different fertilizers out there that are organic. Your extension agent would be the best source. Your ag extension agent would be the best source of information on that. We can't recommend a certain type, but there's a lot of different ones out there. And myself, personally, I tend to go straight with the bone meal and the using blood meal, and I mix up the portions that I want. Because then I'm not dealing with a lot of other things in there that I'm not sure what they're dealing with. So
we've added just so much compost over the years. Yeah. It's just overflowing, and there's just no more room to.
Yeah, compost. Yeah. Yeah.
Fish fertilizers are also really common. Another thing where you want to be really attentive to when you apply the fish fertilizer to when you harvest, if for no other reason, the smell and the taste. But a lot of local growers.
Yeah. And again, that soil test can tell you may not need to add anything more.
Right.
If your nitrogen's high enough and and phosphorus is high enough, you may not need to amend that soil.
It could also be site specific. Like if you have raised beds, it could be that like this bed needs amendments or this needs amendments because it has tomatoes, whereas these don't. So that can be a really cool, especially middle and high school project, is to test the soil in different places in the garden and really explore like what is going on.
So you guys recommend yearly testing of each bed?
We don't do that.
Okay.
We can't.
That would be great.
Do that.
You could do that every spring. Most people don't have the resources.
We don't do that, yeah.
So obviously labeling what you have in that garden could avoid some of the things like we heard earlier, the mushroom. That mushroom poisoning was because a volunteer was walking through the garden and saw the mushrooms and offered it to the kids, not realizing that was not planted in that area for consumption. So obviously labeling it also gives your kids an idea of what's growing there.
And for little kids, just paying attention to, like, we do a lot of companion planting, but we try to keep foods that are completely inedible in a spot by themselves. Like, we grow sweet peas, but we don't put them next to regular peas. Just some of that simple stuff.
Yeah. But again, making sure that people know what you planted and what's edible, what's not. And then you avoid like what we had in one garden where the nice volunteers came along and pulled up all the seedlings.
Oh,
Because they thought they were weeds. They didn't realize that they were radishes coming up, and if we had just put a label there, you would have realized that there was radish. We all learn our lessons.
There's also really simple rules in a garden. Like in our garden, you have to ask before you pick. So you're not allowed to pick anything unless you ask an adult. And sometimes when we have volunteers who are not knowledgeable, they don't have the right to tell kids if they can eat things. So you don't have to necessarily have every plant labeled. You just have to have a system where kids know, oh, I asked before I eat.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of things in this last thing, so we're just gonna jump right into it so that we don't run out of time here. So Whitney, harvesting success and failures.
And I think some of this for me is I've also managed a farm, so I do have a lot of the good agricultural practices, food safety background, and so seeing the differences is a lot of what I'm thinking about here. But again, having either a hand washing station, which it's really easy to make a makeshift one that fits the requirements, just to make sure you have a dedicated place with soap and water. Your harvest tools being appropriately cleaned. I think in a school garden, this is especially important. We have certain scissors that are in our cooking kits. And so then we know that they always get wash, rinse, sanitized, and we don't harvest with other things because all the tools that we use for pruning and other things, we don't want those to get mixed. But that has been, I've seen be like, oh, please don't harvest with that. And I think, again, involving students is personally my favorite part of any school garden, but you have to make sure that everyone understands what they're doing and why we do things a certain way. And kids are really capable. They're fully capable of washing their hands, of being careful, they often remind me oh, hey, that person dropped that, we can't use that, right? Oh, I need to wash my hands again because I just coughed into them. But just really being clear with students of why. Why do we do this? For me, that's been really successful because they can't totally harvest safely.
And the destination.
Destination of harvest. A lot of this has to do with storage, but just really paying attention to it can be really easy for things to go from okay, we're all gonna harvest a carrot to suddenly people are picking and eating things everywhere. And timing for us in school gardens has been tricky. If the kids are harvesting something that's going to the cafeteria, if it's in the afternoon, the cafeteria staff isn't there anymore. They've left. And so really thinking about how can we get this to a fridge? How can we get this properly stored so that it can be used in the cafeteria, which doesn't always work with the kids' schedule, and the cafeteria staff schedule don't always mix very well. So just really thinking about, we want to harvest these tomatoes. Where are they going to go? How are we going to get them there safely?
So when we think about harvesting, another thing that should come up when you talk in your school garden groups is some sort of illness policy. You don't want kids or adults out in the garden if they're sick. We all know that from this last year. So We don't want people that have diarrhea handling our food. We don't want people that are coughing and not feeling well handling the food. Hand washing, we've touched on a bunch of times. Very simple, easy way to set up a hand washing station with water carboy in a bucket and soap and water. But they need some way to wash their hands, preferably in the garden space or nearby. So they have to go back to the school building and then back out to the garden. It's not going to happen. Okay, and then we have bathrooms. Do you have access to bathrooms at that garden? You don't want your volunteers and your kids not to have access to bathrooms. And then obviously eating and drinking in the garden. This needs to be a policy that you talk about. Are the kids going to be eating in the garden itself? Do you have a way to clean that produce before they eat it? I just want to point out there's different types of foods. When you talk about harvesting stuff, there's a lot of foods that we harvest that are what we call seldomly served raw. So something like a potato. We're not going to be as concerned about that because we're going to cook it, okay? But there's a lot of ready-to-eat foods that we're harvesting, like berries, that basically you're not going to do a lot between the time it's harvested and the time it's consumed. So we're going to be much more careful with those ready-to-eat foods because we know that they may just be very cursorily washed before consumed. So we really want to avoid bare hand contact with those ready-to-eat foods, gloves, different policies, you know, you pick it, you eat it, sort of things as well in the school gardens, so that you don't have people handling something that somebody else is going to consume without any processing. So just something to keep in mind on glove use. And containers, you touched on this, tools, but also the containers that we put the food into. We want to make sure that they're clean and sanitized before they're used. Wicker baskets are very pretty, but they are terrible to clean, okay? Okay to throw your potatoes in, you're going to cook those. But other things, transport vehicles. I don't want you hauling my produce in the thing you just hauled your pigs to. So just something to keep in mind there. Working with your partners, coordinating with the staff and families in terms of making sure that that produce isn't going to go to waste. Making sure that you know what kind of quantity that school kitchen can handle. Doesn't help them if you drop off 50 pounds of carrots and they can only have room for 20. So refrigeration is another thing that coming up with a plan. And then obviously distribution. Is that food going to the cafeteria? Is that food going to a food bank? Is that food just going into a classroom? Is it even being consumed? So just something to keep in mind when you're planning that garden. And we're running out of time, so does quality and quantity matter when you talk about food, okay? Somebody can maybe handle 10 pounds. They may not be able to handle 100 pounds. So that's why it's important to coordinate. We get lots of jokes about zucchini at this time of year, but your cafeteria can't necessarily process 500 pounds of zucchini. So having a plan, this is kind of just a summary here. When you start planning that garden, think about planning, growing, harvesting. What's your plan at each step along the way, and incorporate food safety in that plan, in that growing, and in that harvesting of the food, okay? So just keep that food safety in the back of your mind as you're doing that. And then before we split, and for the people online, there is a resource on the Montana Farm to School webpage under resources. It's kind of down towards the bottom. If you go to that resource page, they have some information about food safety. And this is the food safety tips for school gardens. And it covers most of the material that we talked about today. There are some other handouts there as well about food safety in the gardens. I feel like this one is probably the key one in terms of covering most of that information that you would need to know.